Hello, and welcome back to English 3020. Identity and understanding are often expressed through art. The search for self-enlightenment was specifically fraught, though, for writers of the Harlem Renaissance. They, and other African Americans in the United States, had to grapple with the duality of their identities, being both African and American. The effort to reconcile these two facets of self often resulted in self-doubt and confusion. Our writers for this week all document some aspect of the identity-forming experience of African Americans. So join me this week as we take a look at the identity crisis facing Black Americans in the 20th century. W.E.B. Du Bois is our first author for this week. He was born in 1868 and 1963. And while he was a part of the Harlem Renaissance movement, Du Bois is not really considered one of the main writers of that literary period. He was more of an intellectual. His major work, The Souls of Black Folk, came out in 1903, so kind of is a work that predates the Harlem Renaissance, though he was active in racial politics and in American society at the time of the Harlem Renaissance, and did, have some say and influence in that movement. His full name is William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. He was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. His mother died when he graduated high school, but he did receive a scholarship to attend Fisk University, which was originally founded to educate the children of former slaves and was located in Tennessee. And this was the first time Du Bois had traveled to the South, was when he went away to college. Du Bois graduated from Fisk and attended Harvard. He later became the first African American to earn a PhD there. Despite this and the prestige he had won there, he had a hard time finding a teaching position, but was eventually hired at the University of Atlanta. In 1896, he married Nema Gomer. They ended up having 2 children together. In addition to his writing, Du Bois is also famous for creating the Niagara Movement in 1905, which was the first black protest movement of the 20th century. He was the only black founder of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and was the editor of their journal, The Crisis, for several years. And Du Bois disagreed with previous African-American intellectual leader Booker T. Washington, and Booker T. Washington believed, among a variety of other things, that the only route to equality for blacks was through economic advancement. He believed that by achieving economic success, the vote and political and social equality would follow. Essentially that if blacks were to prove they were necessary to the capitalistic structure of the country, they would eventually be granted those social and political rights by the white population. And he kind of encouraged the education of blacks in agriculture and trade schools, and actually founded the Tuskegee Institute to help achieve those ends. Du Bois, though, on the other hand, really disagreed with this. He advocated instead for the active advancement of political and social equality. He believed that true equality could never be achieved without political power and rights. So he kind of sought to provide black students and intellectuals with a more robust education, a liberal arts education, not just training them for occupations. And in his later years, Du Bois became more radical, which led to a decline in his popularity. He had a few falling outs with the NAACP. He got into some conflict with the U.S. government and had his passport withheld for being part of the Peace Information Center, an organization against the atomic bomb that sought to inform Americans of international current events. And he actually joined the Communist Party in 1961, eventually renouncing his American citizenship, and then spent the last 2 years of his life in Accra, Ghana, where he died. So at the end of his life, we see him kind of move away from his American identity and actually give up that citizenship to return back to Africa. Langston Hughes is arguably one of the most famous American poets, and probably most certainly one of the most famous African-American writers. He was born in 1902 and died in 1967. And he then was definitely considered a writer of the Harlem Renaissance, and a major sort of figure in the Harlem Renaissance. And he sought to portray the oral and improvisational techniques of black culture within his writing. Hughes was born in Joplin, Missouri, but was raised mostly by his maternal grandmother in Lawrence, Kansas. He also spent some of his youth in Detroit and Cleveland. His father eventually moved to Mexico, fed up with racism in America, and his mother, though, was kind of more of a role model for him, supporting his literary leanings, while he had a more kind of conflicted relationship and strained relationship with his father. He spent some time at Columbia University, but eventually dropped out to become a merchant seaman, working at a Paris nightclub and as a busboy in D.C. He used this kind of free time he had during these occupations to really devote his time to writing poetry. And as his poetry began to be published and, became more widespread, he gained many sponsors and patrons who kind of helped him to continue his career in the arts. And he eventually then went back to attend Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. During the Great Depression, like many other intellectuals at the time, he became involved in radical politics, eventually becoming a supporter of the Communist Party. And he kind of turned to the Communist Party because that political movement really promoted racial justice and the idea of unity among working class people, and that kind of was very appealing to Langston Hughes and others at the time. He eventually actually visited the Soviet Union, and kind of as a result of this, in 1953, during the Red Scare, McCarthy's committee interviewed him because of his communist activities in the 1930s. He was put on a list as a security risk until 1959, which actually led him to write more patriotic poetry to kind of revise his public image. And Hughes's poems are really inspired by urban black life, so we've seen a lot of reference to the South in some of our African American writers. Hughes's poems are really poetry of the urban African American experience. And he brings components of jazz and black vernacular speech into his poetry. He was also inspired by white writers, though, and was unafraid to kind of draw from those who had come before in the literary tradition of America. Now, although Hughes had great pride in the African American culture, he was not blind to the injustice and deprivation based on race that they faced in the United States. His poems express the need for America to give blacks credit for all they have contributed and continue to contribute to American society. So celebrating black culture, but also realizing they had not yet won the respect it deserved. Keltie Cullen is another writer of the Harlem Renaissance, and he was born in 1903 and died in 1946. Similarly to Claude McKay, and unlike other poets of the Harlem Renaissance, Cullen really drew on and valued traditional poetic forms taken from the artists of England and America. So things like the sonnet and structures like the quatrain were very appealing to Cullen, and he uses those in his work. And Cullen sought for black poets to be considered American poets without any kind of adjective or explanation describing their race in front of them. So he really wanted his work just to be considered American, just being accepted as part of the larger canon. Despite this, though, he still really sought to write about the black experience while not necessarily using those structures of black folk tradition. Again, kind of using those more traditional structures of American and European poetry. And even though he kind of had a particular view about structure and form and traditional writing styles, Cullen really embraced the diversity of genres, styles, and forms of black writing that were flourishing during the Harlem Renaissance. We don't know a ton about his early life. We do know he was adopted by a family that lived in Harlem. He ended up attending New York University and then got an MA at Harvard. He was an assistant editor at a black journal titled Opportunity. He actually married Nina Yolande Du Bois, who was the daughter of W.E.B. Du Bois, but unfortunately this marriage only lasted 2 years as Cullen was attracted to men. Despite this, a Guggenheim Fellowship allowed him and his wife, before they separated, to travel to Paris. Cullen's later writing was not as popular as his earlier writing, and he spent the remainder of his short life teaching at a New York junior high school. And in his work, Cullen really combines and uses those traditional forms to discuss race and racial identity, and along with that comes the theme of self-doubt and self-questioning that accompany such discussions. Our last author is Ralph Waldo Ellison. He was born in 1914 and died in 1994. So he kind of comes a bit after the Harlem Renaissance writers. So he was born in Oklahoma City, and when he was 3 years old, his father died in an accident. Originally, his parents had settled in Oklahoma to give their children a better life, as Oklahoma did not have a history of slavery, and his parents worked actively to keep laws that would make segregation legal out of the state's constitution. Ellison would later go on to say that his experience in Oklahoma gave him a larger view of the horizon and kind of a sense that he could achieve anything, and this is something he would not have experienced if he lived in the southeastern part of the United States that had a history of slavery. Ellison's father actually named him after American transcendentalist writer Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was writing in the 19th century. As his father hoped he would become a poet, Ellison was a very voracious reader, and he actually read the authors of the Harlem Renaissance while he was in grade school, so they did influence his work. For a good part of his youth, his original focus was on music and not on writing, specifically the trumpet. He went on to attend Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama, the school founded by Booker T. Washington, who actually inspires a rather unflattering character in Ellison's Invisible Man. So although Invisible Man is not a strictly autobiographical novel, there's a lot of elements we can kind of connect back to Ellison's life. He ended up leaving college to go to New York to raise money for his senior year. While there, he met Langston Hughes and Richard Wright, and the latter author influenced him very greatly. And then in New York is where we see Ellison switch his focus from music to writing. He became a merchant marine, and during that time he met Fanny McConnell, and they married in 1946. He then published his famous novel Invisible Man in 1952, and this work is a very long kind of tale of an unnamed narrator who is exploring his identity through a variety of experiences in both the South and New York City. And it's a very kind of complex, symbol-heavy, abstract text that's very challenging, kind of considered a masterpiece of American literature. Despite his fame as an author, some members of the Black community disliked Ellison's integrationist beliefs and support support of the Vietnam War. Throughout his life, he wrote many essays and nonfiction pieces. And another theme of Invisible Man deals with the conflict Ellison experienced between the wide open possibility of the frontier and the reality for African Americans in the rest of the United States and the limited opportunities they faced. Despite this, he had a firm belief that the power and expression of Black art and culture was important. He also resisted the ideas of Black nationalism and Back to Africa movements, seeing kind of America as the place where African Americans could eventually achieve their equality. Focusing again more on integrating into society and becoming a part of the society without sacrificing any of that unique and powerful Black culture. And when Ellison died, the second novel he had been working on was almost 2,000 pages long. So this was a man who would write pages and pages of text and then kind of whittle it down into a readable form. So when Ellison died, he left behind a large volume of writing, both of his unpublished novel and other essays and sort of short pieces of writing.